He stands in a windowless basement beneath Pearl Harbor, May 1942, a rumpled figure in a smoking jacket and slippers, where most officers would wear pressed khakis. Commander Joseph Rochefort has not slept more than 4 hours in the last 72, and it shows in the stubble on his jaw, the cigarette ash on his makeshift desk, the way his eyes move across columns of 5-digit numbers like a man reading a language only he can see. Around him, the machinery of station HIPO hums and clatters. Typewriters, fans pushing stale air through cramped corridors, the occasional burst of profanity when a code group refuses to yield its meaning. On the wall, a map of the Pacific stretches from Hawaii to Japan, marked with pins and grease pencil. Somewhere out there, in the vast blue emptiness, the Imperial Japanese Navy is planning something massive. The intercepted radio traffic suggests a target designated AF. But what is AF, and when will the blow fall? In Washington, the intelligence analysts at OP-20G have one theory. Rochefort has another. And in the next 72 hours, his interpretation of a handful of broken numbers will determine where Admiral Chester Nimitz sends the entire remaining carrier strength of the United States Pacific Fleet. If Rochefort is right, America gets a chance to ambush the Japanese at Midway and turn the war. If he is wrong, those carriers sail into a trap, and the Pacific belongs to Japan for years, maybe forever. This is not a story about steel and fire alone. This is about the moment when the fate of the Pacific hung on one exhausted man in a basement, staring at numbers that might mean everything or nothing, and the admiral who had to decide whether to trust him. 6 months earlier, Chester Nimitz had arrived at Pearl Harbor to inherit a disaster. The battleships of Battleship Row were still settling into the harbor mud, oil slicks spreading across the water like open wounds. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. The nation was in shock. And Nimitz, calm, methodical, a man who spoke quietly and chose his words with the precision of an engineer, carried the weight of an ocean on his shoulders. He was not Douglas MacArthur with his theatrical flair, not George Patton with his pearl-handled revolvers and profane brilliance. Nimitz was something different. A strategist who understood that in the kind of war that was coming, information mattered as much as ammunition. The Japanese had the initiative. They had more carriers, more experience, more momentum. Nimitz had exactly 3 operational carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battle-scarred Yorktown, limping back from the Coral Sea with repair crews still welding her flight deck. If he lost those carriers in the wrong fight, the war in the Pacific would be over before it truly began. He could not afford mistakes. He could not afford to guess. What he needed, more than planes or ships or even time, was to see the enemy's hand before it was played. That was where Joseph Rochefort came in. Station HIPO existed in a parallel world beneath the sunlight and ceremony of the naval base. It occupied the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters, a maze of cramped rooms with no windows, poor ventilation, and the constant mechanical hum of IBM tabulators and commercial air conditioning units that barely kept pace with Hawaii's heat. The men who worked there, cryptanalysts, linguists, traffic analysts, translators, were not the parade ground type. They were often eccentric, sometimes brilliant, occasionally impossible to manage through normal naval discipline. Rochefort himself was all of those things. He had not come up through Annapolis like most senior officers. He was an outsider in a fraternity that valued pedigree and polish. He spoke fluent Japanese, understood the culture and mindset of the Imperial Navy, and possessed an intuitive gift for intelligence analysis that made him invaluable and, to some in Washington, deeply irritating. He worked marathon shifts. 36 hours without rest was not uncommon. And he dressed for comfort, not regulations, often appearing at high-level briefings in his smoking jacket and slippers, unshaven and reeking of cigarettes, while admirals in starched whites exchanged uncomfortable glances. But Nimitz did not care about appearances. What he cared about was whether Rochefort could do the impossible. Break the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, the operational cipher that protected their fleet movements, battle plans, and strategic intentions. JN-25 was a monster. It used a code book where every word or phrase was represented by a 5-digit number. And then those numbers were further encrypted using an additive table that changed regularly. Breaking it meant stripping away the additive through mathematical analysis. then reconstructing the meanings of thousands of five-digit groups by studying usage patterns, context, and educated guesswork. It was, as one of Rochefort's team later described it, like assembling a jigsaw puzzle when most of the pieces were always missing. By May 1942, Rochefort and his team were reading enough of JN-25 to provide Nimitz with daily intelligence summaries, fragmentary, incomplete, but better than fighting blind. They had been right about the Coral Sea, predicting Japanese intentions accurately enough that Nimitz had sent his carriers to intercept. That victory, costly but crucial, had earned Rochefort credibility. Now, in the traffic flooding station Waipo's receivers, he saw the shadow of something bigger. The Japanese were planning a major offensive. The target was coded AF, and if Rochefort's analysis was correct, AF was Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand 1,200 miles northwest of Hawaii, just important enough to house an airstrip and a garrison, and strategically positioned to extend Japan's defensive perimeter deeper into the Pacific. But this problem was that Washington disagreed. Analysts at OP-20G, the Navy's cryptologic headquarters in Washington, had studied the same intercepts and reached a different conclusion. They thought AF might be somewhere in the Aleutians, or perhaps even the West Coast. The debate was not merely academic, it would determine where Nimitz positioned his carriers, and positioning them in the wrong place meant losing the war. Rochefort was certain. He had studied the patterns, the context, the subtle clues embedded in partial decrypts. AF had to be Midway. But certainty without proof was just another guess, and guesses got people killed. So Rochefort proposed a test. The idea came from one of his staff, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, but Rochefort refined it and took it to Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's intelligence officer, who in turn brought it to the admiral. The plan was elegant and risky. Have Midway send an unencrypted message reporting a problem with their water distillation plant, a routine maintenance issue broadcast in the clear for any Japanese listening post to intercept. If AF really was Midway, the Japanese would report the water shortage in their own coded traffic, and station HIPO would be listening. On May 20th, Midway transmitted the message. Plain language, no encryption, the kind of routine communication that sailed through the ether every day. The desalination system had broken down, fresh water was limited, emergency repairs were needed. Rochefort and his team waited. Had the Japanese intercepted it? Would they take the bait? Had they suspected deception? On May 22nd, Station HIPO intercepted a Japanese message. It was encrypted, part of the normal operational traffic. When the cryptanalyst broke it down, the message was clear. AF is short of water. In that instant, the map in Rochefort's mind snapped into focus. AF was Midway. The target was confirmed, and the Japanese were coming. Nimitz received the intelligence in his office overlooking the harbor, the same harbor where 6 months earlier the Japanese had shattered the myth of American invulnerability. He was a careful man, not given to rash decisions, but he was also a man who understood that intelligence was useless if you did not act on it. Rochefort and Layton briefed him on the details. The attack would come in early June, most likely the 4th or 5th. The Japanese would strike from the northwest. The force would include Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's first carrier striking force, the same carriers that had hit Pearl Harbor, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. It would be the most powerful naval formation in the Pacific. Layton, drawing on Rochefort's analysis, gave Nimitz specifics that were almost surreal in their precision. The Japanese would approach on a bearing of 325 degrees, approximately 175 miles from Midway, at around 0600 on the morning of June 4th. It was the kind of prediction that, if wrong, would haunt everyone in the room for the rest of their careers. Nimitz asked the question that mattered. How sure are you? Rochefort did not lie. The intelligence was good, the best they had, but JN-25 was not fully broken. There were gaps, uncertainties, the possibility of deception. What they had was not certainty. It was a pattern, a probability, a window into Japanese intentions that was clearer than anything they had possessed before, but still clouded by the fog of war. Nimitz made his decision. He would trust Rochefort. He would position his carriers northeast of Midway, on the flank of the approaching Japanese force, and wait for Nagumo to strike. It was an ambush built on numbers and intuition, on the work of exhausted men in a basement who had turned radio static into strategic intelligence. If the analysis was right, the US would have surprise, the most valuable commodity in war. If it was wrong, Nimitz would be sending his carriers into a trap, and the Pacific Fleet would be finished. Enterprise and Hornet steamed out of Pearl Harbor on May 28th. Yorktown, her repairs still incomplete, limped out on May 30th, her flight deck patched with wooden planks and her hull held together by welds that had not fully cured. Nimitz had gambled everything on the man in the smoking jacket who read Japanese like poetry and saw patterns in chaos. The battle unfolded exactly where Rochefort said it would. On the morning of June 4th, 1942, at 5:34 local time, a U.S. Navy patrol plane spotted the Japanese carrier force 200 miles northwest of Midway, right on schedule. Nagumo had launched his strike against the atoll, confident that the Americans were scattered and unprepared, unaware that 3 U.S. carriers were already in position to the northeast, waiting in the darkness before dawn. What happened next has been told and retold. The confusion of the early strikes, the brave and doomed torpedo bomber runs, the moment when dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers with their decks crowded with fueled and armed aircraft. In minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were burning wrecks. Hiryu struck back, crippling Yorktown, but was herself found and destroyed later that afternoon. By the end of the day, Japan had lost 4 frontline carriers and their most experienced air crews. The United States had lost Yorktown, but the heart of its carrier force survived. Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. After June 4th, 1942, Japan would never again possess the strategic initiative. But the victory was not won by courage alone, nor by steel and fire, though there was plenty of both. It was won in a basement in Pearl Harbor by a man who had read the enemy's mail and convinced an admiral to risk everything on that knowledge. The public cheered. The newspapers ran headlines about heroic pilots and the tactical brilliance of American commanders. Nimitz received the accolades due a victorious fleet commander. But Joseph Rochefort, the man whose analysis had made the ambush possible, remained in the shadows. Station Hypo's work was classified, its existence a closely guarded secret. The codebreakers who had cracked JN-25 could not be mentioned, could not be photographed, could not be celebrated. Worse, the politics of naval intelligence turned toxic. Rochefort's success at Midway made enemies in Washington, particularly among the analysts at OP-20G who had argued that AF was not Midway and who now faced the professional embarrassment of having been wrong at the most critical moment of the war. There were turf battles, petty jealousies, the grinding machinery of institutional rivalry. Nimitz recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal immediately after Midway. The recommendation was quietly buried. By October 1942, Rochefort was removed from command of Station HIPO and reassigned to lead a floating dry dock, a humiliation for a man who had just helped win the most important naval battle of the Pacific. He spent the rest of the war in obscure postings, his contributions unrecognized, his name absent from the histories being written even as the war continued. It would take decades for the full story to emerge. Rochefort retired in 1947, returned to civilian life, and died in 1976 without ever receiving the recognition he deserved. 10 years after his death, in 1986, the Navy finally awarded him the Distinguished Service Medal. By then, the men who had worked beside him in that basement were old or gone, and the war they had fought had passed into legend. There is a question that sits at the heart of every great military victory, a question that we argue about long after the cannons fall silent and the monuments are built. Who really wins wars? Is it the general on the bridge, the pilot in the cockpit, the marine hitting the beach, or is it the person no one sees, the one in the back room with the broken code and the pattern no one else noticed? George Patton had Oscar Koch, his G2, the intelligence officer who saw the bulge coming when everyone else was blind. Chester Nimitz had Joseph Rochefort, the man in the smoking jacket who read Japanese radio traffic like sheet music and told an admiral where to position 3 carriers against the most powerful fleet in the Pacific. Neither Koch nor Rochefort commanded divisions, neither gave speeches or posed for photographers. But without them, Patton never breaks the siege at Bastogne, and Nimitz never wins at Midway. Wars are not won by a single mind or a single decision. They are won when the loud, confident commander has the wisdom to listen to the quiet, rumpled analyst who smells like cigarettes and looks like he has not slept in a week. Because that analyst has spent 72 hours staring at 5-digit numbers and has seen something no one else can see. Midway was about pilots who flew into fire, about sailors who fought with extraordinary courage. But before any of them launched, before the first bomb fell, the battle was shaped by a man in a basement who convinced an admiral that a few broken pieces of intercepted radio traffic were enough to risk the future of the Pacific Fleet. You already know how Midway ended. You have seen the movies, read the histories, heard about the dive bombers and the burning carriers. But now you know the other half of the story, the intelligence triumph that made the tactical victory possible, the trust between a fleet commander and a codebreaker, the moment when one man's interpretation of incomplete data became the difference between winning and losing a war. In your own life, in your own decisions, who is your Rochefort? Who is the person you trust when the information is incomplete, the stakes are catastrophic, and the crowd is shouting louder advice? Do you listen to the voice that tells you what you want to hear, or the one that tells you what you need to know? Nimitz chose to trust a man in slippers who saw patterns in static. That choice saved the Pacific. The Japanese came to Midway, expecting an easy victory. They found 3 American carriers waiting in the dark, positioned exactly where a codebreaker said they should be. That was not luck. That was intelligence. That was trust. And that was why, when the sun set on June 4th, 1942, 4 Japanese carriers were sinking into the Pacific. And the war had changed forever. The man who made it possible went back to his basement, lit another cigarette, and started working on the next set of intercepts. History would forget him for decades. But the victory was his as much as anyone's.